Hey guys, Jay here, and we've still got some time before the new F1 season, and of course the new F1 fantasy season, F1 Fantasy 2025. So I thought I would do a video just giving some thoughts on what I would change in terms of F1 fantasy for this season if I was able to. And then you can let me know what you think. If you agree with what I say or if you disagree, what would you change? Let me know in the comments. So I've got 8 things that I've written down that I think I would change. So I'll go through them one by one. I've just put them in like no particular order. So there's no like preferences, priorities. They're just no in particular order, just what I would change. So the first thing I would do is bring back the streaks. So I started playing F1 Fantasy back in 2022, and I'd actually forgotten about the streaks until it was mentioned recently. I think it was in the FanAmp podcast that reminded me about the streaks. I think the streaks were a great idea. The streaks, from what I remember, was, for example, let's say if Esteban Ocon, just for an example, was to qualify in the top 10 or 5, say 3 times in a row, that was a streak, so you'd get more points if I remember correctly. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I vaguely remember the streaks. I vaguely remember that was part of the strategy of like, okay, well, Pierre Gasly has hit like Q3 the last 2 weeks. I think he'll hit Q3 again this week. So yeah, I think the streaks were a great idea, and it went up to times 5 if I remember correctly. After times 5 it would reset. So I think the streaks were a great idea, especially given the way last season was, because obviously last season ended up becoming quite close in the end. Obviously at the start of the season we thought it was going to be another Max Verstappen dominance, but then it ended up being a three-way battle for the constructors, a two-way battle, almost a three-way battle for the drivers. And we had some, shockers right at the end. Zhou Guanyu scoring Sauber's points at the end of the season for the first time in the season. So yeah, I think bring back the streaks if possible. Changes to the DNF scoring system. So this was a big one with F1 fantasy players. Everyone was getting hit by DNFs. Everyone was trying to avoid DNFs. Alexander Albon is a great example. He's a good driver. We know what he is capable of, but he had a terrible season when it came to DNFs. And there were times, I know for me, I would pick him thinking, oh, he's looking strong this weekend, DNF, and times where I wouldn't pick him because I was scared of getting a DNF, and he wouldn't get a DNF. It happened to a few. There was also, now that I think about it, there was also the thing of like George Russell in Spa, where he got disqualified after the race. So, yeah, DNFs was a big thing. Now, I've kind of had the same thought on this since the beginning, which is I don't have a problem with DNF negative points, providing it is only the driver that caused the situation. And what I mean by that is, for example, if it's a mechanical fault, or if another driver has crashed into that driver, it shouldn't be any negative points. Just make it 0. They should just either make it 0 or don't change, don't affect them, because it's not their fault. Don't give them negative points for something that ain't their fault. But if it is their fault, if a driver crashes into another driver, then yes, they should get negative points. I can't think of a particular example right now, but let's just use Monaco, for example, with the 2 HAASes and Perez. Or we can even use Baku with Perez and Sainz. Whoever's deemed to be the one at fault for that accident, they get the negative points. That's my view on that, because I don't think it's fair that, for example, Pierre Gasly had a mechanical fault in, I can't remember which race it was. I want to say it was the Brazil Sprint, but I think I'm wrong. But if you picked Pierre Gasly, you got minus 25 points, even though it wasn't his fault. So that's my fault on the DNF scoring system. It just needs, I think, yes if it's their fault, no if it's not. Keep the driver of the day bonus. So again, this one was controversial after the whole Daniel Ricciardo thing. Daniel Ricciardo getting driver of the day in Singapore, because the rumours going around was that it was going to be his last race, and it turned out to be true. But for me personally, as much as I can see why people might not want driver of the day, I would keep it, because I think over the course of the season, most of the time it's been legit. Now, I will hold my hands up and say, to be fair, as an F1 fantasy player, I try and use this to my advantage. So there were times I would deliberately vote for someone that was maybe in my team, maybe Lando Norris, because he was my times two. But that's part of the game. But I think in a general sense, most F1 fans don't play F1 fantasy. So therefore, we can assume that most of the time it's legit driver of the day by the fans, if that makes sense. So I would keep it. Talking of keeping driver of the day, we then go on to the fastest lap. Now, I did a video a while ago talking about the fastest lap, because that's actually being removed from the real life F1 this season. They're getting rid of the fastest lap bonus point. In terms of F1 fantasy though, I would keep it. I think for us as F1 fantasy players, it's a nice little extra. Is it 10 points if I remember correctly? It's a nice little bonus. I think for us F1 fantasy players, keep the driver of the day, because even before the fastest lap bonus point became a thing, they would still tell you who got fastest lap anyway. So for us F1 fantasy players, I would keep fastest lap, even though it is being removed from the real life F1 this season. More user-friendly interface. Now, I am partly saying this because I messed up during my season on my videos, but also because, again, this came up in the FanAmp podcast a few months ago at the end of the season about the interface being more user-friendly. I'm one for pinning my leagues, and I remember at the start of the season I pinned the F1 Nation League, and then I would kept referring to that thinking it was the global league. It was only until after the summer break that I realised what I'd been doing, and my ranking was actually a lot lower than what it was, which was a bit of a kick in the teeth. So because you can't pin the global, you couldn't pin the UK league in my case, the team league, so that was McLaren for me, the driver league, which was Lando Norris for me, you couldn't pin them. But I was pinning all my other leagues. I was pinning, had my own league pinned. I pinned the Nation League. I would pin like the Vegas League, other F1 fantasy content creators leagues that I joined later in the season. I would pin them, but I couldn't pin the main ones. So it took like half the season for me to twig that, oh, I've been looking at the wrong league. Now, that's my fault. But again, I would also argue, make the user facing more friendly, because I remember back in 2022, because 2023 I can't really count because I got really sick. So I didn't really play it that much. But in 2022, it was like right there in front of me, like straight away. I knew where it was and I didn't have to think about it. Whereas I think this league, with all the extra leagues that were going on, it got a bit like messy and confusing for some people, including myself. But that's just me. Changes to the substitute asset prices. Now, I can't remember if it was Ollie Behrman or if it was Liam Lawson. I think it was Liam Lawson towards the end of the season, but I could be wrong. But when they substituted for, I'm not Carlos Sainz at the start, but towards the end, when Ollie Behrman substituted for K-Mag and Liam Lawson took over Daniel Ricciardo, I think it was Liam Lawson, but one of them, their price was higher than the asset that they were substituting for. And I didn't think that was fair for two reasons. And I could be wrong about this, but the first reason was, one, what if I had planned, or what if you had planned to bring in, say, Daniel Ricciardo, but all of a sudden you need an extra 1,000 because it's now Liam Lawson. That was my first issue with it. My second issue with it was, if the driver did well, their value increased. So I remember thinking at the time, does that mean then that if I bring in this substitute asset and their value increases, I've now just boosted my bank. If I just made more budget, it only, don't get me wrong, it's nothing like major. It was only like 100,000, something like that. But it still crossed my mind, like, could you just bank more money now because that asset is more money, if that makes sense. I personally think substitutes should only be the same value maximum as the person that they're substituting for. In fact, if I think about it, if they're only substituting for, say, one race, it should just be the same value. I think that's fair. Just keep it the same value. Either that or have some kind of like reserve bank, but then that's just going to get all complicated or something. But yeah, I just don't think substitute drivers should be more valuable than the actual drivers that have got a seat, if that makes sense. And then finally, team selection before sprint qualifying. So, excuse me, sprint weekends, sorry, you was able to update your team after sprint qualifying. Now, I assume this was just to keep things with like the usual rotation. So Friday would be practice, Saturday would normally be practice, and then after third practice you could do your team before qualifying on Saturday afternoon. And obviously sprint qualifying would be in the mornings because you'd have the sprint qualifying would be Friday afternoon because you'd have the sprint race Saturday morning. All that said, I think two things. I think you should still have to choose your team before sprint qualifying, but also reward us. And it's a sprint weekend. You pick your team before sprint qualifying, but then for the points that are given out in qualifying, for sprint qualifying, make it half. So, you know, like how in like the point system in F1, 25 points for a race win, 8 points for a sprint win. In terms of F1 fantasy, similar. Like you get your points for winning the main race. You get your points for getting pole position in F1 fantasy, but also you get half that if your driver gets pole for the sprint race. So I think team selection before sprint qualifying, but at the same time, we should be rewarded if we've picked the right assets for that. So that's what I would personally change in F1 Fantasy for 2025. I don't think the rules are out yet at the moment. I mean, it's still early days. We're still in January. I'm recording this on Sunday, and I'll try and get the video out for Tuesday. Videos are going to be kind of like hit and miss at the moment because obviously this new season hasn't started. For example, I shared a Gran Turismo clip last week because I was given an early birthday present from Gran Turismo, so thank you to them. And before that, I built an F1 2023 McLaren Lego Formula 1 car that I got for Christmas from my mother, so thanks to her. If you want to check those out. So yeah, until the new season starts, it's going to be very hit and miss. But this was something I was thinking about doing the other day. Like, what would I change in F1 Fantasy? And these are kind of my thoughts. Nothing, I haven't like thought too deep about them, but these are just kind of things that have like crossed my mind and what I think about them. And yeah, so I'd love to know what you think. Do you agree? What would you change? And yeah, thank you for watching. If you have, I really appreciate it. And I will speak to you real soon. All the best.